March 21, 1945. A single line on an American radio net echoed across ruined Europe. By nightfall, General George S. Patton's Third Army had taken an entire German corps off the map. 15,000, then 50,000 in a single day. Word reached Berlin like a blow. The Western Front had collapsed. In the Führerbunker, witnesses later remembered an unnatural silence, not anger, but a realization that the war was ending not by one titanic battle, but by an American storm of speed, psychology, and ruthless momentum. This is the story of that day, how Patton's lightning turned surrender into a flood, and how men who had fought in Stalingrad chose to lay down their arms rather than die pointlessly for a lost cause. Patton's Third Army entered March 1945 already a machine of motion. After crossing the Rhine in February and exploiting gaps that others feared, Patton refused to pause. He told his commanders, "I'll never tell you again. Go." Between March 18th and March 21, his armored columns punched through the fragile German rear, racing along secondary roads the enemy assumed were impassable. Logistics crews strained to keep fuel flowing. Reconnaissance pushed far ahead to bait failing German defenses into revealing themselves. The Germans had a dangerous mix of exhausted veterans from the East, raw conscripts, and shattered morale. Where the Wehrmacht attempted order, Patton's units shredded it with speed. Encirclements formed before commanders could react. Communications collapsed under the weight of retreat. By the third day, entire divisional headquarters found their map tables empty and their men streaming toward surrender.
Patton's triumph was as much mental as it was physical. He and his staff understood that speed inflicts a special kind of pressure. Not every soldier dies from a bullet. Many surrender to the belief that resistance is futile. Task forces fanned out to capture crossroads and railway yards, then broadcast captured German orders and false radio traffic to amplify confusion. Small patrols seized bridges intact and left captured radios playing enemy frequencies. Leaflets promised humane treatment to whoever laid down arms. Veterans who had bled in Kursk and Kharkov, men who knew the true cost of grinding resistance, confronted the calculus of survival. For many, surrender to the Americans meant life. Continuing to fight meant pointless slaughter. The result? Whole battalions walked into assembly points, hands raised, while German officers scrabbled for orders that never came.
On that decisive day, a date later marked in many American after-action reports, Patton's spearheads converged on a shattered German grouping trying to reform behind a river line. With bridges seized and flanks sealed, surrender cascaded. Whole regimental columns, deprived of fuel, ammunition, and clear orders, chose to march into the waiting arms of American MPs. Field reports recorded mass capitulations at dawn, at midday, and again at dusk. One divisional report tallied tens of thousands queuing to relinquish their rifles rather than face annihilation. For Allied logisticians, it was a nightmare to process. For frontline soldiers, it was proof that momentum, not slaughter, would end the war. American officers later described the day as surreal. Battalions traded battle for bureaucracy, and maps filled with penciled-in red marks for POW collection zones.
The day after the mass capitulations, the Third Army's rear areas became a new front. A logistical and humanitarian surge unlike anything the Americans had planned for. Trucks that once hauled fuel and ammunition were redirected to carry prisoners to collection points, while quartermasters scrambled to issue rations, blankets, and basic medical care. Field hospitals, already stretched by combat casualties, now treated malnourished men who'd endured the Eastern Front and weeks of retreat. Interpreters and captured clerks were pressed into service to identify unit designations. Cooks boiled soup in enormous kettles as MPs organized queues under canvas. For commanders, this was an operational puzzle, how to keep advancing forces supplied while feeding and guarding tens of thousands. But for the men on the road, it offered a strange reprieve, from the terror of the front to the dull bureaucracy of captivity.
Numbers tell part of the story, but the human faces reveal the rest. Among the surrendered were Kriegsmarine sailors, Wehrmacht infantry who'd been shipped back from the Eastern Front, teenage Volkssturm recruits, and Wehrmacht veterans with frostbitten hands. Interviews collected after the war recall men who'd fought in Tunisia, Leningrad, and Kursk, now shivering beneath Allied tarpaulins, reluctant to speak, but eager for bread. Some officers burned orders rather than hand them over. Others tried to persuade subordinates to escape into the countryside and continue guerrilla warfare. Yet many simply sat and stared, the trauma of defeat heavier than the weight of their packs. American medics recorded recurring themes: exhaustion, hunger, a desperate desire to know whether their wives and children lived. On both sides, the war's human toll was suddenly visible in concentrated, intimate detail.
When the reports reached Berlin, the Führerbunker's atmosphere shifted from controlled fury to taunting disbelief. Dispatches show that Hitler and his staff, already isolating themselves in late March, received regular summaries of Western Front collapses. Witnesses later described an uncharacteristic hush. Aides read long lists of towns lost, and then the names of captured formations. The Führer's response was not a single dramatic order so much as a flurry of contradictory directives. Hold here, counterattack there, execute the deserters, orders that could not be enforced. Radio silence and desperate denunciations followed as the Nazi High Command tried to reconcile doctrine with a reality that refused to conform. In short, the regime's ability to translate decree into action disintegrated, while American men in the field translated speed into capitulation.
Surrender in 1945 was rarely simple cowardice. For thousands who'd survived brutal Eastern campaigns, the calculation was grimly rational. Many remembered the annihilation at Stalingrad and the endless counterattacks that bled units dry. They had seen what fanaticism demanded and how little the Reich could now supply. Psychologists and military historians later noted three recurring motives: exhaustion from attritional warfare, calculation that surrender to Americans offered better treatment than capture by Soviets, and the collapsing authority structure that left men without orders. Add to this Patton's deliberate use of speed and deception, seizing supply hubs and radio frequencies, and the choice to lay down arms became a survival decision. In many cases, entire units chose life over ideology.
Patton's genius was not only audacity, but institutionalized mobility. His staff built columns that could refuel and change direction faster than German commands could react. Reconnaissance units probed relentlessly. Armored divisions exploited every breach, and engineers worked round the clock to keep bridges open. The Third Army's doctrine emphasized aggressive patrolling, air-ground coordination, and striking at the enemy's ability to assemble cohesive defenses. In practice, this meant Germans never had the time to form linear defended fronts. They were forced into fragmented pockets where surrender, not pitched battle, was the realistic outcome.
Senior German officers later admitted that the psychological shock of American speed, people, fuel, and steel arriving like a tide, degraded unit cohesion far faster than shell fire.
As Patton spearheads fanned east and northeast, tactical encirclements multiplied. Pocketed German formations found their communications severed, radio relays cut, couriers captured, and headquarters overrun. The result was not merely territorial loss, it was command paralysis. Regimental commanders who once issued clear directives now received contradictory orders from corps and army echelons, some demanding stand-and-fight counterattacks, others begging for organized withdrawal. Without fuel or maps, many units made ad hoc decisions. Some tried to melt into the countryside, others massed at crossroads hoping for relief. Patton's forces exploited those junctions, making rapid local decisions that turned confusion into formal surrender. By late March, whole German divisional staffs functioned more as relief applicants than fighting headquarters.
Speed needed supplies. Patton's push stretched supply lines until logistics became the decisive battlefield. The Third Army improvised. Fuel barges, emergency pipeline segments, captured German trucks reworked for Allied use. Quartermasters issued fuel on strict priority to spearhead units, while rear echelons used captured depots to refill. Saboteurs and road craters slowed progress, but engineers moved faster than demolition teams. The Germans, deprived of fuel and transport, watched as armored columns slipped through gaps they couldn't block. What looked like pure audacity to contemporaries was in truth a carefully managed gamble. The ability to keep vehicles rolling was as important as the steel itself. Where the Allies could resupply, Germans surrendered. Where they could not, desperation continued.
Air support magnified Patton's mobility. Tactical fighters and fighter bombers strafed retreating columns and interdicted railheads, severing reinforcements before they could arrive. Close air coordination allowed ground commanders to press advantages immediately rather than pause to consolidate. Pilots carved open pockets in which armor could exploit gaps. Reconnaissance aircraft supplied near real-time updates that made German countermeasures futile. Luftwaffe capacity in the West had waned dramatically by March 1945, leaving the Third Army essentially uncontested from the air. The result was a vicious cycle. As German formations failed to reconstitute, Allied air power increased its effectiveness, which in turn made the option of organized retreat ever less possible.
Amid grand maneuvers, small moments accelerated surrender. Patrols that captured a single supply depot could feed dozens of starving men. Medics treating a wounded officer sometimes convinced his men to stop fighting. The sight of well-fed civilians waving from windows undermined Nazi propaganda of total collapse only at the front. There are recorded instances of American MPs parlaying humane treatment into mass capitulation, not through threats, but through bread and shelter. Conversely, extremist propaganda and threats of punishment from certain German commanders prolonged resistance in isolated pockets. These human-scale interactions, a hot meal, a calm interpreter, a captured letter home, repeatedly shifted individual choices from fight to survive.
Information was a weapon. Captured clerks, interrogations, and seized signal logs gave Patton's staff a critical advantage: knowledge of German dispositions and intended movements.
Interpreters became force multipliers, turning captured papers into operational action. Signals intelligence, even at a modest field level, allowed quick redeployment to anticipated weak points. The Third Army's intelligence officers often exploited captured German timetables and supply lists to direct strikes at the most vulnerable nodes. This ruthless conversion of enemy paperwork into tactical advantage accelerated capitulations. Units facing an incoming armored column, known to be informed by their own intercepted orders, often chose to walk into assembly points rather than wait for destruction.
Late March saw a deadly coup against German mobility. Railheads and marshalling yards that had once fed the Wehrmacht were systematically neutralized. Patrols and airborne reconnaissance pinpointed key junctions. Fighter bombers disrupted timetabled traffic. Demolition teams rendered sidings useless. With rails choked, the German army lost its last efficient way to move reserves and supplies. Commanders who hoped to fall back in orderly trains instead watched columns of infantry and half-tracks clog roads already contested by American armor. The strategic effect was immediate and stark. Units either tried to form ad hoc road-bound retreats, easy prey for mobile Allied forces, or surrendered when they realized no trains would arrive. The Third Army's ability to deny the rails turned an operational advantage into a strategic collapse.
As POW numbers soared, the issue leapt from tactical logistics to political consequence. Local military governments and Allied high command argued over disposition. Who would guard, feed, and transport the masses? Reports reached Schaeff that the Third Army was sheltering tens of thousands, straining local resources and civilian tolerance. Simultaneously, Allied propaganda offices recognized an opportunity. Publicizing humane treatment underscored a moral contrast with Nazi brutality. The political calculus affected operations. Commanders had to weigh rapid advance against the humanitarian bottleneck. Washington and London monitored the situation closely. Newspapers would soon carry images of surrendered German soldiers, framing surrender as both a military and moral victory for the Allies.
Accounts from the line repeatedly cite a grim reason why many Germans surrendered to the West: fear of the East. Veterans who had served in Russia knew stories of retribution and annihilation. Prisoners captured by the Red Army faced uncertain fates that had already become part of wartime rumor. Allied propaganda amplified this preference. Leaflets and loudspeaker broadcasts informed German soldiers that surrendering to Americans or British troops offered better odds of survival and eventual return. This dynamic created a perverse funnel. Units retreating east to avoid capture instead found their paths blocked or cut off, and many, weighing rumor against reality, chose Western capitulation. The phenomenon altered the strategic map. Where Soviet and Allied fronts met, surrender patterns often reflected geography and fear rather than pure military calculation.
Diaries and after-action notes from both sides reveal the mental erosion of command in early April. German regimental logs show increasingly terse entries: no fuel, command lost, units scattered, while American brigade reports glow with terse, efficient metrics: objective seized, prisoners 6,200. Senior German officers recorded desperation, counterattack orders without men, messages sent to non-existent depots, and the bitter admission that ideology could no longer substitute for supplies. Allied journals, Patton's among them, celebrate momentum, but also record practical anxieties about maintaining cohesion while handling prisoners. These contemporaneous documents make one thing clear. The collapse was not sudden, but cumulative. An everyday exhaustion of systems, morale, and command that reached a tipping point under Patton's pressure. By early April, the Third Army's accomplishments forced a sobering debate. Speed had won territory and prisoners, but created responsibilities that blurred lines between military necessity and humanitarian duty. Commanders confronted ethical choices on the fly. How to treat SS detainees, how to prevent reprisals by liberated civilians, how to prevent disease and starvation in makeshift camps. Patton's critics argued that an unrelenting push sometimes left prisoners and civilians in peril. His defenders countered that ending the war quickly saved countless lives. The documentary record captures both views, victory's sheen and its messy aftertaste, and suggests that the moral calculus of rapid warfare is never exclusively triumphant. It accumulates obligations that outlast the last shot. As the Third Army rolled through towns and villages, liberation and humanitarian need collided. Civilians emerged from cellars and attics to find streets clogged with prisoners, burning depots, and exhausted soldiers. Military government units raced to provide food, medical care, and law and order while displaced persons streamed toward collection points. Local supplies had been looted or destroyed. Bakeries were cold, wells contaminated. American engineers and NGOs coordinated emergency bakeries and water purification units, but the scale overwhelmed immediate relief. The optics mattered. Photographs of emaciated civilians next to orderly POW columns fed Allied propaganda, but they also forced commanders to divert trucks, guards, and manpower from the front to save lives. Liberation created a responsibility that altered operational priorities and revealed war's moral ledger in stark terms. The mass surrenders reshaped post-war bargaining. As Allied columns advanced, political officers in Washington and London watched maps closely. Where Allied forces stopped would influence occupation zones and post-war authority. The Third Army's rapid gains complicated diplomatic choreography with the Soviets. Advances into certain towns risked friction at future demarcation lines. SHAEF correspondence from mid-April shows urgent cables clarifying limits and patrolling rules to avoid incidents. The PO flood also posed questions about custody and repatriation. Who would return whom and on what timetable? Military success had immediate geopolitical consequences. Speed on the ground translated into leverage at the negotiating table, but it also raised the chances of misstep in the fog of war. Among mass movements were moments of private mercy that left long shadows. American chaplains and non-commissioned officers intervened to prevent summary executions, negotiated medical care for SS prisoners to avoid reprisals, and arranged for family reunions when possible. A captured German company commander, wounded and near death, was iced by an American medic whose own brother had been killed on the Eastern Front. The medic insisted the man be saved. These decisions, rarely recorded in official dispatches, rippled through the ranks. Prisoners who experienced humane treatment later testified that such acts undermined Nazi hatred and eased post-war reconciliation.
In other cases, abuses occurred and were punished. The record is mixed, but these small acts of conscience changed the fates of individuals and, in microcosm, shaped the moral settlement that followed victory.
Contemporaneous diaries and post-war witness statements describe an extraordinary moment in late April when a cascade of reports from the Western Front landed on the Führerbunker desk. The file included intercepted communiques, maps with American advances inked in, and lists of captured formations. One telephone call, phrased in a terse Wehrmacht situation report, reported yet another major surrender and the effective dissolution of a corps. Witnesses later recorded that Hitler's reaction was not an explosive tirade, but stunned silence, followed by a curt series of orders that made little operational sense. The emotional impact was profound. Here was a leader whose entire strategic edifice depended on centralized control, now facing evidence that his instruments of war were dissolving into surrender. The bunker had lost not only territory, but the ability to make reality match ideology.
The final week of April crystallized the pattern. Hitler's orders grew more diluted, while frontline commanders increasingly ignored them. As Patton's columns pressed onward, German High Command issued scattered countermanding orders that could no longer be enforced. Isolated pockets, surrounded and bereft of supplies, chose capitulation when faced with the humanitarian choice of life or a hopeless counterattack. By May 1, the map showed not just conquered territory, but a systemic breakdown. Lines of command broken, rail and road routes under Allied control, and hundreds of thousands in captivity. The cumulative effect argued a grim logic. Victory required less triumphal pitched battle than relentless pressure that turned the enemy's will against itself. Patton's Third Army had not merely taken towns, it had catalyzed a national unraveling.
By April 29, the Third Army's inexorable pressure had become a geopolitical and psychological hammer. Field reports showed surrender lines stretching like a net. Divisional packets, once capable of counterattack, now delivered only tired lists of men who would not fight. In Berlin, the Führerbunker courtroom of doom registered the evidence in real time. Messengers arrived with fragmentary maps and names of captured formations. Aides read aloud the totals of prisoners flowing westward. The effect on Hitler was corrosive. Not only military loss, but the collapse of the very myth that sustained his will. On April 30, 1945, with Allied columns closing and the Eastern Front bearing down, Hitler took his life. Contemporary testimony ties his final disintegration to the steady, systemic failures on both fronts, a cascade in which Patton's momentum was one decisive element among many that made defeat unmistakable.
The days after Hitler's death were a cascade of formal surrenders and administrative chaos. Between May 2 and May 15, Allied armies transformed battlefields into processing lines, field hospitals, and provisional courts. The Third Army continued to funnel captured Germans into camps, and by war's end, its cumulative prisoner count, over 600,000, and by some tallies, including late detentions, approaching 650,000, became a defining statistic of the Western collapse. Allied authorities faced immediate questions about repatriation, war crimes, and reconstruction. Captured soldiers would be witnesses, defendants, and, in many cases, ultimately free men returning to devastated homelands.
For the victors, the operational victory blurred into political responsibility. How to judge collaborators, how to prosecute criminals, and how to rebuild a Europe hollowed by years of organized brutality. Patton's campaign in the final months of the European War crystallizes a hard lesson. Wars end as much by collapse of will and logistics as by pitched cinematic battles. The Third Army's blend of relentless mobility, intelligence exploitation, and psychological operations turned a tactical advantage into a strategic unraveling of German resistance. That unraveling, measured in hundreds of thousands of prisoners, broken railheads, and silent command posts, helped make Hitler's fall inevitable. Yet victory carried ambivalence. Commanders faced humanitarian burdens, political complications with Allied partners, and ethical dilemmas about occupation and justice. Patton himself remained a contested figure, lauded for operational brilliance, criticized for controversial statements, and an unyielding hunger for movement. Historically, his late-war sprint helped shorten the conflict, but it also left a complex afterimage, a victory achieved by speed that demanded responsibility in equal measure. The story of March-May 1945 is therefore twofold, an account of breathtaking military momentum and a reminder that the final chapters of great wars are written in both maps and human lives.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe to our channel for more.